Okay, so as you noticed, have I started off with introduction lectures, and I've been giving you videos discussing various aspects of um, American politics with presidents, and I'm trying to interweave, uh, um, as I said, I was going to try to do political events that are going to be significant to switching us from the issues with the Soviet Union and this turn to the so-called war on terror. And I say the so-called war on terror because, as one U.S. politician puts, terrorism is a tactic. War on terror is war on a tactic. That's doesn't really. Um, it's not very logical. It's not very straightforward either. I mean, so for example, a war against communism, whether we agree or disagree, whether we agree with the way that it was always handled or not, is a clear set of objectives, right? There's this thing called communism. The US is going to go to war against any state that favors communism or anything that favors the Soviet Union's communist state. And so a war like that, it's very clear cut what the objectives are. And that's why, as you look during this time period, the U.S. will sometimes abuse civil rights here in the United States to try to stop communism. It will bypass human rights or other ethical positions in other parts of the world to stop communism, but it's got a very logical, straightforward objective, which is to halt communism, and specifically that promoted by the Soviet Union. And sometimes, occasionally, the U.S. would support communist regimes if they were at odds with the Soviet Union, or Nixon helped put a rift between China and Russia to weaken communist states. In other words, Sun Tzu in The Art of War says, if your enemies united, divide him. Ultimately, you look at every U.S. foreign policy when the Soviet Union exists, and it breaks down to a certain logic in that means. And then, we get to George Bush, the father, the senior, right? And the Soviet Union falls. And as was discussed in the crash course video, the U.S. was really built up for this. And here's the theory that I make about the problem of where we get to now. I mean, I was in high school, almost graduating, graduated as when the Soviet Union falls. So keep in mind, when I was a kid, everything was about the Russians and the Soviet Union and fear of communism. Everything. That's all we were obsessed about. All of our older relatives. That was the topic. You get a cold and they blame communists. You don't like somebody. There's something wrong with it's communist, Russians, fear, and all the movies reflected that, right? And the U.S. government, like I said, is like geared towards doing everything to stop communism. And the Soviet Union, the big bad evil, terrible Soviet Union that's a threat to the free world, just collapses. Okay? And what ends up happening is there's lots of various alternative points of view as to what really made the Soviet Union crumble. Many Americans feel that it was Ronald Reagan, okay? Because he had such a strong position against the Soviet Union, and he definitely made it look that he helped set that in motion. Many argue that the Soviet Union simply just wasn't working right, and its own system just kind of made it collapse, as was stated in the crash course video. The soldiers from Afghanistan, the Islamic fighters that the West, meaning the United States, helped support, fight the Soviets in Afghanistan, they see the Soviet Union fall shortly after their fight against the Soviet invasion. And they actually believe, and this is part of the ideas of Al-Qaeda, that it was Islamic fighters in Afghanistan fighting in that long war, and what some say that we helped give, Brzezinski, a U.S. official under Carter, called it the Afghan trap, in which he said we gave the Soviet Union their Vietnam. In other words, we helped bog them down in Afghanistan, and they failed in Afghanistan. In other words, in the way that we failed in Vietnam, and getting our objectives. So they were trying to advance or keep up communism and failed there, and we tried to push away communism in Vietnam, and we failed there. Of course, I like how nobody's really addressing all the human cost to all of this, but that's a whole other topic. In any case, many of these religious fighters in Afghanistan actually felt that they were responsible, in fact, by further extension, God, okay, for the fall of the Soviet Union. And so, with the fall of the Soviet Union, you have a very amped up set of religious ideologues, religious fighters, okay, and in the Islamic world. And you have a very confident United States, in fact, being left as really the only superpower after the Soviet Union falls. But what I argue is that what complicates things from this point on is that the US has been set up to fight in a manner and to deal with things ideologically in a manner that are no longer applicable. And this is one of the arguments I make as to why US foreign policy now doesn't have the logic that it did in the Cold War. It has very little consistency. And it's why I think that we're finding now that U.S. foreign policy, whether it's under Republicans or Democrats, is, to be honest, I don't want to put my own opinion. It's not consistent. Okay, let's put it that way. And it doesn't have a way to get a consensus where we can all agree on exactly how these objectives, like what our objectives are, and to help. And how this advances U.S. interests in the world, and how this actually makes the world a better place. All of this is very, very vague with this idea we have a war on terror, right? And what is that? If it's a war on a tactic which has been used since the beginning of time, this war will never end. It's a perpetual war, right? We had a war against communism. Communism fell apart. China is still communist, but they've basically switched into capitalism now. So then what are we doing, right? So it's become a very, very complex. Now, having said that, there were several other things that ended up happening, which we have the rise of Bill Clinton and the Clintons, okay, after Bush. Now, Bush was very popular in winning the first war against Iraq. So when I was in high school, prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein, who was supported by the U.S. government, and I think you saw some of that in these other videos, he fights Iran, who's not popular, and he gets support. But then, of course, we supported both sides to make them both bleed. We also supported him. On one hand, he also got support from the Soviet Union, but Saddam Hussein was very anti-communist at that. And this gets really complicated because the Soviet Union didn't always care about communists in other countries as much as we didn't always care about human rights, as we said. Both the United States and the Soviet Union both were always acting in their own state self-interests, and they could be hypocritical in terms of like their ethics that they claimed that they were going to do. But Saddam Hussein, one of his first acts was to imprison and clean out all the communists in Iraq. But he had a theory. Saddam Hussein basically said this. He supports communism in other countries. And so it's great if the Soviet Union has communism, and he supports that. And he supports Africans having communism. And Saddam said because they don't have great civilizations like Arabs. Arabs themselves can thrive off their own great Arabness. And so he was a nationalist, and he followed a party that was started by an Arab Christian from Syria named Michel Aflaq. And in fact, Saddam Hussein's right-hand man, Tariq Aziz, was Chaldean Roman Catholic Christian. Okay, and so he was more of an Arab nationalist, and he fights Iran, and the U.S. is okay with that. And then Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, and his invasion of Kuwait was seen as, well, it wasn't supported by the US, and the Arab nations were afraid of it, and it seemed that it could turn the balance of power upside down, and because of issues of oil. And so almost instantly, and I remember this as a teenager, Saddam Hussein was all over the news as the most evil person that came since Hitler. And they keep invoking Hitler, as they always do that. They always do that, by the way, as if there's only one dictator that ever existed. It was Hitler. And when you want to make everybody hate that particular terrible person, you just say Hitler, Hitler, Hitler. Of course, Saddam Hussein was the same terrible person that we supported the whole time. So this Hitler-like guy was okay when it was in our interest. Now he invades Kuwait, killing far less people than he killed in Iran. But now he's Hitler. So anyhow, you get this shift, and we go into, there's the Gulf War, and the victory is immediate, it's profound, and yet we don't overthrow Saddam Hussein. And Bush decides to keep him in power. And why? Well, I'll leave you a clip of what Dick Cheney said at the time. Okay. Now, Iraq is going to be, there's going to be a policy to contain Iraq with sanctions under Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton, for, being the liberal that was hated as, liberals are always seen as like these pacifists, and they come off sometimes as more passive. Bill Clinton is able to assert U.S. foreign policy in a way that was also unprecedented. When there is a conflict in Serbia with Milosevic, and there's some internal ethnic cleansing from the country, NATO, if you remember, was set up to only say that if a NATO nation member is attacked, that it's like attacking all of them. And so, in other words, it's a defense mechanism to keep the Soviet Union from invading other states, and saying, hey, if you attack a NATO member, it's like attacking all of us, and we'll all come at you, right? Okay, but what ends up happening is that Bill Clinton uses NATO to attack Serbia for an internal crisis that was happening. So with NATO allies, Bill Clinton ends up using NATO in a way that it was never used before. It was basically to police another state, to attack another country for what they were doing from within to their own people. Now, for many Europeans and many liberals, this was seen as a great human rights adventure. But for many others, more cynical, and even on the left and on the right, there was a question about the role of the U.S. now asserting itself in people's internal affairs without the excuse of the Soviet Union to justify it. And ultimately, then also under Bill Clinton, he kept the sanctions going on against Iraq, continued to talk about the threat of Saddam Hussein, and we also, with the British, bombed Iraq in the no-fly zones, basically since I was in high school up to prior to 9/11. And so we will get to 9/11 in just a little bit here. I hope I'm not losing you too much. I basically want to try to weave into a lot of the backgrounds of all these various factors of what the U.S. role has been in the world, and where it places us in terms, again, of the shift and where we're at now. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to put a few more videos, and I'm hoping, if you've patiently watched through all these various videos, as choppy as these presentations all are, I'm hoping you're going to start seeing a little more clear about, this, again, how we got to where we're at. So I'm going to stop right here.